In this video, I want to explain to you how unilateral damage to the basal ganglia or cerebellum manifests. And in a nutshell, you already know that the cerebellum, if we have unilateral damage to one cerebellar hemisphere, leads to signs and symptoms on the same side of the body. However, unilateral damage to the basal ganglia leads to signs and symptoms on the contralateral side of the body. And this is what I want to explain. So let's start off by thinking about the wiring of the basal ganglia. So what I'm going to do is draw a very rough outline of the central nervous system. So here are the cerebral hemispheres with the cerebral cortex. Here is the brainstem and the spinal cord. Okay, and because we're thinking about lateralization, we should put the midline on as a dotted line. So this is the overview of the central nervous system. This is going to help us to understand why unilateral damage to the basal ganglia leads to contralateral signs and symptoms. However, before we start putting pathways on, we need to put some key landmarks on. So deep within the hemispheres, you know that we have the thalamus, and the thalamus is present on the left and the right hand side. So there are two separate thalami, one on the left and one on the right. And since we're talking about the basal ganglia, we should add on the lentiform nucleus. And remember that the lentiform nucleus is composed of two components, the putamen sitting more laterally and the globus pallidus sitting more medially. So these are our basic landmarks. And since we're thinking about the motor system, we need to put on the major motor pathway, the canonical motor pathway, which we know the most about, and that is the cortico-spinal pathway, which I'm going to depict in red. So here is the cell body of an upper motor neuron, and you should recall that its axon passes down through the internal capsule, it decussates in the medulla, and then goes all the way down, say through the spinal cord, until it gets down to a lower motor neuron, which it synapses upon, and then that lower motor neuron synapses on a muscle. So in red, we have the very basic motor pathway, the chain of two neurons going from motor cortex to the muscle itself. And it is through this pathway that behaviours are mediated. So we should recall that the basal ganglia are involved in a looping circuit with the motor cortex. And that looping circuit involves projections going from the motor cortex to the basal ganglia and projections from the basal ganglia going back to the motor cortex via the thalamus. So the first part of this looping circuit involving the basal ganglia we're going to depict in this purpley pinky colour, and that is the corticostriatal pathway. So the corticostriatal pathway originates within the motor cortex and projects down to the striatum. And you should remember that the striatum is composed of the putamen and the caudate nucleus, but I haven't drawn the caudate nucleus on here, just the putamen. So the corticostriatal pathway essentially represents the pathway whereby the motor cortex sends the motor plan down to the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia, as we discussed in a previous video, analyse the motor plan proposed by the motor cortex, and then they need to send the results of their analysis back up to the cortex itself, and that has to go via the thalamus. So what we have is a pathway going from the globus pallidus, and we're using green for this, the pallido-thalamocortical pathway, a pathway going from the globus pallidus via the thalamus and then up back to the motor cortex. So by using the pink and the green neurons, we have completed the arc, the circuit, if you like, between cortex, basal ganglia and cortex. So this is that loop which helps the brain to analyse the motor plan and to perfect it in order so that the behaviour mediated by the corticospinal system is composed of most appropriate movements. One final component we need to add on to this is the dopaminergic pathway going from the substantia nigra up to the striatum. And I'm going to use black here because these neurons are pigmented. And so here is the substantia nigra, which sits within the midbrain. Of course, there is one on each side, but I'm only showing you the one side. And that projects up to the striatum. And that is the so-called nigrostriatal pathway, providing a source of dopamine to the basal ganglia. So this pathway I have drawn shows us something very, very interesting, I think. We already know that damage to the upper motor neuron in the cerebral hemisphere or in the internal capsule leads to contralateral signs and symptoms due to the fact that the corticospinal pathway decussates in the medulla. But look further. Note that the basal ganglia loop as well as the dopaminergic pathways all communicate with the motor cortex on the same side. So damage to any part of the basal ganglia unilaterally in one hemisphere would lead to contralateral signs and symptoms. All right? However, we know in real life that basal ganglia lesions do tend to be bilateral because they are most commonly caused by neurodegenerative conditions such as Parkinson's and Huntington's disease, which tend to be roughly symmetrical. However, in the case of a unilateral basal ganglia lesion, say here, this would manifest as signs and symptoms on the contralateral side of the body. So that's basal ganglia dealt with. However, the far more common situation that you have to deal with is unilateral damage to the cerebellum, to just one of the cerebellar hemispheres. So in this case, let's draw on, once again, an overall plan of the central nervous system, but include the cerebellum on this one. So here are the cerebral hemispheres, just like we drew over on the opposite side. Here are the cerebellar hemispheres, so there's one, there's the other. Here is the brainstem going down into the spinal cord. And then here is the midline because we're talking about decussation and laterality. So just like when we considered the basal ganglia, we need to put on the canonical motor pathway, that being the corticospinal pathway. So here is the cell body of an upper motor neuron. We know that it passes down through the internal capsule, down into the medulla where it decussates, descends through the cord, and then synapses on a lower motor neuron, which projects to a muscle. So this is our corticospinal pathway, and without the corticospinal pathway, we could not have any behaviour, okay, because we wouldn't be able to instruct our muscles what to do. We need to add one additional landmark, and that is the thalamus. And the reason for that is because if the cerebellum is to communicate with the cerebral hemispheres, that has to be via the thalamus. If any part of the CNS wishes to communicate with the cerebral hemispheres, it goes through the thalamus, with only a few exceptions. So there are the two thalami on each side. Now, the cerebellum participates in a looping circuit with the motor and sensory cortices. So we can add that on. But it's a little bit more complicated than in the case of the basal ganglia, because the input to the cerebellum from the cortex goes through another relay station. And this is a set of nuclei known as the pontine nuclei sitting within the pons. So let's put on the so-called corticopontine pathway. So the motor cortex is going to communicate its motor plan to the cerebellum via the corticopontine pathway. So here is a neuron which is going to send this motor plan down ultimately to the cerebellum. So it goes down to the pons, where it synapses upon one of these neurons of the pontine nuclei, and the neurons of the pontine nuclei themselves decussate to the contralateral cerebellar hemisphere. So this is the cortico-pontine pathway ending up within the cerebellar hemisphere on the opposite side. Now the cerebellar hemisphere needs to communicate back with the motor cortex, and that takes place through a pathway known as the cerebello-thalamocortical pathway. So there are neurons within the cerebellar hemispheres which communicate with the contralateral thalamus, and then these neurons of the contralateral thalamus, of course, project back to the motor cortex. So we have a very interesting setup here, in that this motor cortex on this side sends its motor plan to the contralateral cerebellar hemisphere, and this cerebellar hemisphere then sends the results of its analysis for sequencing of the movement to the opposite motor cortex. And in fact, when you see a double decussation, the result is essentially no net difference. Okay, so the result would be that a double decussation leads to ipsilateral features. Let's build upon this a little bit more, because what we also need to add is the spinocerebellar pathways. So if we add on the spinocerebellar pathways, so we can do this using our blue colour, so we know that the spinocerebellar pathways are collecting information from muscle spindles, and that these are primary sensory neurons carrying that information, which send it up along the ipsilateral side of the spinal cord to the cerebellar hemisphere. For those of you who've read up on this, I'm specifically drawing the dorsal spinocerebellar tract. The ventral spinocerebellar tract does something a bit different. And you can see there is a further reason why ipsilateral cerebellar damage leads to ipsilateral signs and symptoms, because the sensory pathways run to the ipsilateral cerebellar hemisphere. So let's just go over that one more time just to make sure it's concrete, but let's start in the cerebellum. Imagine there was damage to this cerebellar hemisphere here on this side. That would mean that cerebellar hemisphere was unable to process information from the ipsilateral side of the body via the spinocerebellar tracts. Furthermore, because this cerebellar hemisphere communicates with the contralateral motor cortex, and that contralateral motor cortex communicates in turn with the contralateral side of the body, there is no net effect such that ipsilateral cerebellar damage leads to ipsilateral signs and symptoms in the body. So this is just me trying to explain to you the neuroanatomical basis of basal ganglia and cerebellar lesions with respect to the wiring and where pathways cross the midline. So thank you for listening.